My name is Victor Mannion, and I followed that order for nearly 60 years. I didn't question it at the time. That's the part people don't like hearing. They imagine silence always comes from fear or corruption or weakness. Sometimes it comes from training. Sometimes it comes from knowing exactly how far authority can reach when it doesn't bother explaining itself. In 1966, I was a ranger assigned to night patrols in a section of forest that rarely made it into visitor pamphlets. No scenic overlooks, no campgrounds, just miles of timber, service roads, and radio-dead zones we were taught to work around. I was good at night work, always had been. Some men need daylight to feel oriented. I trusted the dark more. You learn what belongs and what does when you stop relying on sight alone. That night began without drama. Clear weather, low wind, a routine shift that should have ended with a cup of burnt coffee and a clean logbook entry before dawn. I checked out the truck, folded my paper map along the same creases I'd worn thin over the years, clipped my radio to my shoulder, and rolled out just after sundown. The forest settled the way it always did at night, slowly, deliberately. Day sounds thinning out, night sounds taking their place. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable. Until the call came through. It wasn't rooted through dispatch. No call sign, no preliminary tone, just a click of static and a voice that didn't identify itself. Mannion, it said, calm, even, as if we'd already been speaking. I acknowledged out of habit, then realized my mistake. Procedure matters on the radio. You don't respond to incomplete transmissions. You don't confirm receipt unless the call is logged. The voice didn't correct me. Remain where you are, it said. Do not advance, do not illuminate. I looked down at the map spread across my lap. According to it, I wasn't near anything that required that kind of instruction. No restricted sites, no ongoing operations, no reason for an order that specific. I asked for clarification. The radio hissed softly, like it was still open but no one was speaking into it. Then the voice returned. This is not for the logbook, it said. You will remain in position and observe only. Observe what? The question never made it past my lips. Something in the tone shut it down. Not threat, certainty. I killed the engine and stepped out of the truck. The night air was cooler than it should have been for that time of year. Still, heavy. Sound didn't travel far. My boots on dirt sounded louder than the forest around them. I didn't turn on my flashlight. That detail matters, because every instinct I had was telling me to flood the tree line with light, to establish edges, to force the forest to define itself. Instead, I stood there in the dark, hands resting on my belt, radio warm against my shoulder. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time behaves differently when you're waiting without understanding why. That's when I noticed the absence. Not movement, the lack of it. The forest hadn't gone quiet in the normal way. It hadn't stopped. It had paused, as if something had leaned in and everything else was holding its breath. I shifted my weight just slightly. From somewhere ahead of me, branches adjusted in response. Not breaking, not rustling, adjusting. The sound was soft and deliberate, like someone making room. I didn't move again. The radio clicked once. Do not illuminate, the voice repeated. I whispered into the mic, asking who was issuing the order. No answer, just that same open channel hum. That was when I understood this wasn't about safety in the way we usually mean it. This wasn't a warning to stay back from danger. It was a directive to maintain conditions. Whatever was happening out there required darkness, required non-interference, required my silence. Something shifted again, closer this time. Not fast, not slow, measured. I could feel it without seeing it. The way you feel a large presence nearby without needing proof. The way the air seems to organize itself around a point you can't locate. My hand drifted toward the flashlight out of instinct. The radio came alive instantly. "Do not," the voice said, sharper now. "This is not for you to resolve." That sentence has stayed with me longer than any image ever could. Not for you to resolve. I lowered my hand. For the next stretch of time, I couldn't tell you how long, I stood there while something moved through that section of forest without revealing itself. Shadows adjusted where there should have been none. Depth shifted. The space between trees felt negotiable. I didn't feel hunted. I felt managed. Eventually, the pressure eased. The forest resumed its ordinary sounds as if someone had released it. Crickets, wind through needles. Distance returned to where it belonged. The radio crackled one final time. "You will file no report," the voice said. "You will log equipment status only. You were not assigned to investigate this area." Then the channel went dead. I stayed where I was for several minutes after that. Not because I was told to, but because I needed to be certain whatever required my stillness was finished with me. When I finally returned to the station, no one asked why my patrol time didn't match my mileage. No one questioned the absence of notes. It was as if the night had already been accounted for. I followed the order. I stayed quiet. And that silence became part of my service record, just not in writing. I didn't sleep after that shift. I went home, showered, sat at the kitchen table, and waited for morning like it might explain what the night refused to. When the sun finally came up, it felt thinner than it should have, like it was illuminating a version of the forest that had already decided what it would allow me to remember. At the station, everything functioned normally, too normally. Dispatch logs showed no irregular calls, no open channels, no directives. My radio was inspected without comment and returned to service. The truck mileage discrepancy was corrected with a penciled adjustment I didn't make. That's when I understood the order hadn't been improvised. It had been anticipated. Over the next few days, I tested the edges of my own memory. I replayed the sounds, the timing, the cadence of the voice. It wasn't military exactly. It didn't bark commands, it issued conditions, as if what mattered wasn't obedience but preservation of a specific state of affairs. I didn't talk about it, not to colleagues, not to my wife. Silence felt less like a burden and more like a continuation of the order. I followed it instinctively, the way you continue holding your breath after a loud noise until you're certain it's over. Then the gaps started appearing. A ranger from a neighboring sector didn't report in after a late patrol. His truck was found parked neatly, engine cold, keys still in the ignition. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away. The incident was handled quietly. Weather exposure was cited. Case closed without ceremony. Except I recognized the location. It wasn't where he'd been assigned. It was adjacent to where I'd been told not to illuminate. I said nothing. Weeks later, a maintenance crew requested authorization to install new lighting along a service road that cut through that stretch of forest. The request was denied without explanation. No safety rationale, no budget issue, just a simple notation, not advised at this time. That phrasing matched the tone of the voice. I began paying attention to the way orders moved through the system, which ones were explained, which ones weren't. The unexplained ones always shared the same characteristics: no paperwork trail, no signatures, and no opportunity for appeal. And everyone obeyed them. Not out of fear, out of habit. The forest itself seemed to reflect that structure. Areas near the unlit sector behaved differently during night patrols. Radios stayed quiet. Wildlife avoided the periphery without obvious cause. Sound carried inconsistently, like it was being redirected rather than absorbed. One night, months later, I was assigned a patrol route that brought me uncomfortably close again. No direct overlap, just near enough to feel the edge of it. As I approached the boundary, my radio warmed against my shoulder, not transmitting, just active, waiting. I stopped short of the line I'd memorized without ever marking on a map. From the darkness ahead, something shifted, not toward me but in place. The sensation was identical to that first night, the air organizing itself, space becoming conditional. I didn't reach for the flashlight. I didn't need to be told this time. The radio clicked. "Correct," the voice said. One word, calm, satisfied. Then nothing. That was the moment I realized the silence wasn't just imposed. It was learned. The order hadn't been meant to suppress a report. It had been meant to establish a relationship. As long as certain conditions were met, darkness maintained, attention minimized, documentation controlled, the system functioned. The forest responded. Incidents stayed contained. Break the conditions, and something else would be required. I never learned what that something else was. I suspect the people issuing the orders didn't want to either. Years passed. I advanced in rank. I trained younger rangers. I taught them procedure, safety, and how to read terrain. And I taught them something else without ever saying it out loud: when not to push, when to accept ambiguity, when to let a question die. I hated myself a little for that. But I also watched those who didn't learn it leave early, transfer, burn out, vanish from rosters without explanation. The forest didn't need to threaten anyone. The system did that for it. By the time I retired, the night I'd been ordered to stay quiet had been absorbed into the background of my career, a non-event that shaped everything that followed. I told myself that was just how work in remote places went. But that explanation never sat right. Because I knew the truth. That night wasn't about me witnessing something forbidden. It was about me being placed inside a boundary, one defined not by fences or signs, but by behavior. And once you're inside that boundary, silence isn't optional. It's structural. I kept that silence longer than I kept the uniform. That's the part that still unsettles me. Orders are supposed to expire. Jurisdiction ends. Authority fades. But whatever was established that night in 1966 didn't dissolve when I turned in my badge. It stayed with me, shaping how I spoke, how I remembered, how I avoided certain thoughts altogether. Silence became habit. After retirement, people asked me for stories, campfire tales, close calls, bears, storms, lost hikers. I gave them what they wanted, safe stories with edges sanded down. I never mentioned the night patrol that didn't exist in the logs. I never mentioned the voice that issued conditions instead of commands. And I never mentioned the forest that responded. For years, I told myself that was discipline, professional restraint. But discipline doesn't follow you into civilian life. Fear does. So does understanding. I started noticing how often similar incidents appeared in the news, always framed the same way. Missing hikers, equipment failure, weather exposure. No foul play suspected. No deeper inquiry required. The language hadn't changed since my time in service. It didn't need to. The system knew how to talk about these things without naming them. What finally pushed me to speak wasn't guilt, it was recognition. A former colleague called me late one night, decades after we'd both retired. He didn't explain why he'd reached out. He didn't need to. He asked one question. Did you ever get told to stand down without explanation? I didn't answer right away. Neither did he. That silence told me everything. We spoke for hours after that, carefully circling the edges of what we both knew without forcing it into the open. Different parks, different years, same conditions, same restraint, same quiet compliance. It wasn't a coincidence. The night I was ordered to stay quiet wasn't an isolated incident. It was a procedure, one that didn't appear in manuals, because manuals are for things you're allowed to resolve. This wasn't meant to be resolved. Whatever moves through those forests, whatever requires darkness, limited attention, and behavioral compliance, it doesn't operate outside the system. It operates with it. That's the knowledge that changes how you see everything. Not that there's something out there we don't understand, but that there are things we understand just enough to accommodate without confronting. And confrontation, I suspect, would be catastrophic. I don't believe the voice on the radio belonged to a single agency. I don't even believe it belonged to a single person. It spoke with institutional calm, the kind that comes from repetition, from issuing the same order often enough that it no longer needs justification. Do not illuminate. Do not advance. This is not for the logbook. Those weren't instructions meant for me alone. They were conditions meant to persist. If I'm honest, part of me still believes silence kept people alive. Not safe, but alive. The forest didn't escalate because we didn't escalate. We learned where not to look too closely, where not to interfere, where not to insist on clarity. But there's another cost to that approach. People disappeared without answers. Families were given explanations that closed doors instead of opening them. Careers ended quietly. Knowledge was passed down through omission instead of truth. And I helped maintain that. That's why I'm breaking the order now. Not because I think exposing this will fix anything. I don't. I don't even know if it should be fixed. Some systems exist because the alternative is worse than ignorance. But silence should be a choice, not a reflex. If you've ever felt that same pressure in a place that shouldn't have it, if you've ever been told, implicitly or explicitly, not to document what you experienced, understand this. You weren't imagining things. You weren't weak. And you weren't alone. The order to stay quiet isn't about hiding a monster. It's about preserving balance. But balance built on silence eventually demands a price. I've paid mine in years of restraint and half-remembered nights. I'm paying the rest of it now by speaking while I still can. If nothing else, let this stand as a record that the order existed. That on one night in 1966, a ranger was told not to illuminate, not to advance, and not to speak. And that he obeyed. For a very long time.